Good afternoon, Bishop Spong.
Hello there, how are you?
Very well, thank you so much for joining us indeed here on Radio Jones. It's a great pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Bishop Spong, really just fascinating to read your writings, to hear you speak. Somebody who is obviously a devout Christian, you're described as a Protestant liberal Christian, and obviously you're very much more open-minded than we come to understand that most devout Protestant Christians are, certainly more liberal. And that's why I've asked you on today, because when I saw you speak, it really did... It allowed me. I consider myself to be a humanist. I don't consider myself to believe in any sort of religion as such, but in the good of humankind as we are at this moment in time. But to hear you speak of the way that you spoke about freeing the Christian from the shackles of essentially the fairy tales that you're taught to believe in was really very refreshing. Can you just take us back, if you would please, to your early years? Obviously you were brought up as a Christian, is that correct?
That is correct. I was brought up in Anglican, and it was a very fundamentalistic church, very evangelical, and I was taught all the things that people are taught in those places. I was taught that segregation of the races was the will of God. I was taught that men were superior to women. I was taught that it was okay to hate other religions, and especially the Jews. Gosh. And I was taught that homosexuals were either mentally sick or morally depraved, and the Bible things were true. And my life has been something of an attempt to climb out from under all of those debilitating prejudices, which I think have nothing to do with the Christian faith. But that's a longer story.
Well, we'll come to that. But just briefly tell me, you were born and brought up, I assume, at least in North Carolina. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
At what point did you start to question the doctrines that you've just described to us?
I guess it was about age 12, maybe 14. It was young. And I began to be educated, and the more I learned about how the world operated, the less it was obvious that the Bible was much in touch with the world in which I lived. The Bible assumed things that I could not assume. The Bible assumed that the earth was the center of a three-tiered universe, so that when Jesus wants to ascend to God, he just rises up in the sky. The Bible assumes that women are somehow inferior to men. You know, the Bible polygamy for a number of years, number of centuries, because what polygamy assumed was that a woman was property, and so a man could have as many wives as he could afford, just like he could have as many horses or as many cows as he could afford. I became the father of daughters in time that changed the way I looked at women. I'd rather admired my mother. My father died when I was only 12, and my mother was not a very educated woman, and I watched her try to struggle to keep our family together and to keep food on the table, and to be taken advantage of over and over again by a male-dominated society. And so I began to be sympathetic to the causes of women, and that only increased when I found myself as the father of 4 daughters. Those were the things. I also ran into gay and lesbian people who were not anything like what I'd been taught they were. They were not mentally sick, they were not morally depraved, they were fine human beings, they just had a different sexual orientation. So I began to study that. I went to Cornell Medical Center in New York City and worked with doctors over there who taught me about sexual orientation. And I don't think anybody can choose their sexual orientation. I didn't choose mine. I didn't choose to be heterosexual. I tell people I just woke up when I was 12 or 13 and girls suddenly did not seem obnoxious to me any longer. and I began to take baths and dress better and comb my hair and to attract girls' attention. I didn't make a decision about that. Mm-hmm. And then it suddenly occurred to me that no gay person does that either. Mm-hmm. You know, I can't imagine a young man deciding at age 12 or 13 that he might be homosexual, deciding that he wants to be homosexual because he likes to be beat up by his friends and condemned by a job and run out of town and all the other things that we've done to gay and lesbian people through the centuries. Yeah. So the prejudices simply didn't add up to my experience.
Now, at what age did you take up the study of theology? At what point did you decide that you were going to devote your life to the church? That was probably a late teenage decision, but that doesn't mean it was an educated decision.
My father died, as I said, when I was 12. A new priest came, and he was young. I'd never known a priest to be young before. They all had to be 80 to be priests. He was married to a lovely woman. He was alive and fun, and he liked me. Somehow he sort of adopted me as one of his projects, and I adopted him as my surrogate father. And so I really wanted to be like that man more than anything else. And he's the one that first brought me out of my fundamentalism. He was what I would call a church fundamentalist, not a biblical fundamentalist, as he didn't end every argument by saying the Bible says. He ended every argument by saying this is what the church teaches. Well, that's still fundamentalism, but it was a little bit looser, because the church has been teaching for 2,000 years on a wide variety of subjects, and it's hard to pin the church's teaching down. It's very easy to pin down what the Bible says by quoting Leviticus 18:22 or something like that. People look up the verse. So that was a little bit of flexibility, and that was the first step out of that sort of fundamentalistic thing. And then when I got to the university and started my academic training and ran into all the things that you run into at a university, the size of the universe by the study of astrophysics, the way the universe operates, natural law with the study of Isaac Newton, relativity with the study of Albert Einstein, evolution with the study of Charles Darwin, all of these things are commonplace, accepted in the world of academic knowledge, and the Christian church could not relate to any of them. Now, when that happens, you have a choice. You can either give up your Christian faith and become a secular citizen of the new world, or you can cling to your religious faith and give up being educated. That's the choice. And I've tried to do something different from either of those. I've tried to cling to the experience that underlies my faith without clinging to the particular explanations, and I've tried to relate that experience to the world of knowledge that I participate in. I consider myself a child of the 21st century. I'm well educated, I study hard, I work and read every day of my life, and I read well outside the boundaries of Christianity. I read astrophysics, I read chemistry, I read biology, I read history, I read political science. I study the way human beings operate, and then I try to relate to that what I call the Christian experience, which has to do with being fully human.
What is the Christian experience? Because this, I suppose, is what I don't understand. Now, I understand the Christian experience if an individual has the need for the kind of security that that religion gives to them, and that's how I see it. I see that it's a need for some kind of answers that can't be given during our lifetime, that turns people to worship a God, to pick up a book which was essentially written by man. Whichever religion we're talking about, they were all written by the hand of a human being.
Absolutely.
So it's an insecurity that a human being who picks up a religion has a need for something to fill a gap in his life, to give him some meaning to his life. So without being shackled to those fairy tales, if we can call them that, what do you get from Christianity?
Well, let me first of all say that human beings are insecure. That's the nature of our humanity. Human beings are survival-oriented creatures. That's the nature of what it means to be human. And you can meet your security needs not just in religion. You can meet it in becoming a communist. You can meet it in a fascist government. You can meet it in all sorts of things in the world. So that religion is not the only way we seek to identify with our securities. But let me go back to your question. Now, I perceive God as the source of life, and life flows through the universe. You know, life came somewhere around 3.8 billion years ago as a single cell, and has gone from being a single cell over this 3.8 billion years into the complexity of self-conscious human life, to say nothing of all the other forms of life, both plant and animal and insect, that are all out there in the world. But life comes to self-consciousness only in human beings. I don't know, and animals, sheep and cows and horses and pigs, they don't spend any time wondering why they're alive.
Yeah.
They don't know what it means to be alive. They don't live every day anticipating that their life will someday end. That's a human capacity.
Yes.
So I see God, first of all, as the source of life, calling me to live I see God as the source of love, and love, again, is not necessarily a religious concept. Love is seen when a mother cat licks the fur of her baby kitten. Now, the mother cat might not know that that's what love is. That's instinctual behavior. But love flows throughout the universe, and none of us would be alive if we didn't experience love. But love comes to self-consciousness only in human beings. And so that's another way I see God. And I see God in Paul Tillich's terms. He's the theologian, the German theologian who most shaped my life, who died in 1963. He called God the ground of all being. And if God's the ground of all being, then the only way I can worship God is by having the courage to be everything that I can be. So if God is the source of life, God calls me to live fully. If God is the source of love, God calls me to love wastefully. If God is the ground of being, God calls me to be everything that I can be. And if I'm going to worship that God, then I've got to make those gifts available to every other human being. That is, every other human being has got to have an opportunity to live fully and to love wastefully and be all that they can be. And it doesn't matter whether they're black or white, male or female, gay or straight, Protestant or Catholic, Jew or Hindu, Muslim or Buddhist. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you call people into the fullness of their humanity. Now, why I'm a Christian is that when I look at the life of Jesus of Nazareth, as that life has been refracted to me, both through the scriptures, which are man-made, I've studied them all my life, but underneath them there's an experience. They wouldn't have written about this Jesus had they not had a common experience. And when I look at Jesus, I see someone who is fully alive. I see someone who loves beyond the normal human capacity to love. No matter what they did to him, he responded by loving them. And I see one who has the courage to be all that he can be, whether it's on Good Friday when they're killing him or on Palm Sunday when they're trying to make him their king. So I see in him life, love, and being, and this is what I believe God is, and so I see God in him, and I feel called to that kind of humanity, the kind of humanity that he lived out, and I think that's the gift we have to give to all. We have to use the name of Jesus to get people that gift, but I think that's the experience that I'm trying to provide them.
Would it be fair to ask you as a Christian that whether it's possible that Jesus of Nazareth is a story, albeit a story as you've described it beautifully there, a story with incredible depth and meaning and importance, but nonetheless a story?
Well, I certainly think that the stories have gathered around him. Jesus was not born of a virgin. Jesus did not walk out of a tomb resuscitated as a physical body back into the life of this world. Those are the stories that we have wrapped around him. The question I want to ask, though, is what was the power of the experience that caused people to think that those stories were an appropriate way to describe his life?
Absolutely.
And that's what I'd like to get to. It's that quality of his life. And that's what the Bible called a God presence. Now, they understood God very differently from the way I would understand God, but they saw something beyond the limits of the human in Jesus, and I think that's still an experience that I want to validate.
But then again, fair to assume, if that was a human being who was able to live his life in a way that has laid for centuries a pathway for people to get inspiration from, and an incredible individual, fair to assume that there have been others who have walked this earth as human beings.
Oh yes, I make no exclusive claims for Jesus except for me. That is, Jesus is the way into God for me. I'm a child of the West. That's the way into God I've been taught. I walk the Christ path. I don't believe God is a Christian, and I think if I walk the Christ path deeply enough, I will transcend the limits of all religion. The one thing we have in common with people of the world is our humanity. It's not our religion. One of the great theologians that I know, a man named Matthew Fox, likens God to the groundwater and likens religions of human beings to the well structures that we dig on top of the earth so we can access the groundwater. And the well structures all look different because they come out of different cultures and different ideas and different fantasies and different backgrounds. But if you go deeply enough, the water that you access through the well is the same water. And I think that all religions are walking into this God experience. I happen to walk the Christ path, but I don't think God is bound by my religion, not for a moment.
How can your God exist when you're able to when you're able to agree that other religions' gods also exist?
Well, I don't think that's a problem with God. That's a problem with me. The problem with human beings is that we've all defined God in our own image, and then we put the limits of our humanity onto God. I don't think I can tell you who God is or what God is. I can only tell you what I believe I have experienced of that which is transcendent and holy and divine. And I also have to face the fact that I might be delusional. These might be delusions that I have come up with, but I don't think so. So I don't believe that my definition of God should ever exclude anybody else's truth. My hope for sort of an interfaith future is that if I walk the Christ path deeply enough and thoroughly enough, I will inevitably escape the limits of my religion and my culture and my Western civilization. But if the Buddhist and the Hindu and the Muslim and the Jew all walk their path deeply enough, they will also escape the limits of their culture and their nation and their tribe. And someday, on the other side of that journey, we can sit down and say to each other, this is what I have received by walking the Christ path. This is my pearl of great price, and I want to share it with you. You can say to me, but this is the pearl of great price that I've gotten by walking the Jewish path or the Muslim path or the Hindu path, and I want to share it with you. And nobody has to sacrifice that which is holy to them, but we all are enriched by the life experiences of the others, and that's where I think the interfaith future of the world will be. And I think if we don't get to something like that, then genocide is what human beings will do to one another. We'll do it in the name of religion, which I find rather fascinating. And depressing.
Fascinating and tragic, absolutely. That was exactly what was going to be my next point, is that, never before has civilization been at a point where we need to grow up. Now, you use that term grow up in terms of a wonderful phrase that you said, the church doesn't like people to grow up. I'm going to ask you to explain that just very briefly in a minute. But also, us as cultures within civilization, time to grow up. It's time for us to grow up and put our the boundaries that the shackles that are put upon us by our beliefs over years and years and years behind us, and realize that if we don't start to think along the same paths regarding what's important as human beings on this planet now, then, as you quite rightly say, this we're going to end in some very interesting but very horrendous genocide. That's correct.
If you look back at human life, all religion starts with a tribal deity. And the tribal deity chooses a particular people to be the favorite people. The only trouble with that is if you and your people are God's favorite people, people who are not part of you and people become God's unfavorite people, and that justifies almost anything you want to do to them, because if God did them, you certainly have the opportunity, and you're blessed if you reject them too. And we've got to get past that. What we have in common is our humanity. All of the stuff that we have placed around the religious framework simply divides us. The most vicious wars in history have been religious wars. We've exercised persecution against people who believe differently. We've claimed that our Pope is infallible or our Bible is inerrant. Of course, the Muslims are claiming that the Quran is inerrant. Those are all typical claims of insecure people trying to shore up the weaknesses of their own religious tradition. And we've done terrible things to one another in the name of God. In the Western tradition, we've been terribly anti-Semitic. The Jews of Western Europe have suffered at the hands of Christians for 2,000 years, the Holocaust being the great and final explosion of that dreadful thing. But you go back to the Crusades, they were anti-Islamic. We went to Islam to kill the infidels and rescue holy places for the Christian God. That's tribal religion. The Bible is full of tribal religion. God stops the sun in the sky, according to the book of Joshua, so that Joshua will have more daylight to kill more of his enemies. That's not a very noble reason to alter the fabric of the universe. It's a terrible kind of story. And we've got to get past that tribal mentality. Now, I think we do. The thing that impresses me about the Christian faith is that if you go underneath the words of the New Testament, what you find is a common humanity. Paul says when he writes to the Galatians, and that's probably the second epistle he wrote in the early 50s, one of the earliest parts of the New Testament, he says once you get inside the Christ experience, there's no such thing as a Jew and a Greek. That's the tribal boundary. There's no such thing as a male and a female. There's no such thing as a bondsman and a free person. I would also add there's no such thing as a Protestant and a Catholic. There's no such thing as a Muslim and a Jew. There's no such thing as a capitalist and a communist. You look at all the divisions that we place in the human family. Once you get inside the Christ experience, it's something profoundly different from what we have made it out to be. On the other end of the New Testament, when St. Luke tells us the story of the first Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit fell upon the gathered community, and that's in the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts, the result of the Holy Spirit coming does not mean that people get religious. It means that people rise to a new level of what it means to be human. And the symbol in that story is that we were able to communicate across the barriers of language. We were able to communicate across the tribal boundaries. We spoke in whatever language people understood. Now, that's not a miracle story. What that is a symbol that once you understand the dimensions of love, you discover there is a universal language. Everybody understands love in every language of the world, but it's not that you speak it, it's that you act it out. And I think that's where we're headed. That's where we've got to be headed. And to me, that's exactly what the Christ story leads me into doing and being. In the course of my life in my country, I've been deeply involved in the civil rights movement against the church, because the church perpetuated segregation and slavery for hundreds of years. Fight to give freedom and justice and full equality to women, because the church has denigrated women in Western civilization. We didn't allow women to get educated until the 20th century, and we still never had a woman president in the United States. Some other countries in Europe are a little bit ahead of us there, but we're on the verge of that. But we've never elected, and until Barack Obama, we'd never elected a person of color to be president of the United States. Those are the struggles. And I've been on the line for gay and lesbian people. I do not believe that I can denigrate the humanity of any child of God in the name of any sort of religious prejudice. And that's what I think I've got to call the church to do. And I'm happy to tell you that the church I serve, the Anglican Church in the United States, has moved rapidly on race issues, on women's issues, on gay and lesbian issues. Proud to be a member of this church. Now, we have a woman who's the primate of our church. That would be the equivalent to being the Archbishop of Canterbury in America. A woman is in that position. We have openly gay bishops serving in our church, and we've got a significant number of black bishops in America, including in the Deep South. They used to be the segregated. I come from North Carolina, and the Bishop of North Carolina today is an African-American named Michael Curry, and he's elected by the people. And there aren't that many African-Americans in North Carolina, so he had to be elected by the white majority. And he's a very gifted person. He reminds me a lot of Desmond Tutu. He's got the same sort of spirit and life and zip. And he's a devoted person. So I'm really proud of my church. In my lifetime, I've seen us really overturn prejudice after prejudice.
But that's in your lifetime, in a number of decades, compared to centuries of Christianity, as we're talking about in this particular issue. Centuries of Christianity, which, is it not fair to say, have really held back the evolution of mankind, the evolution of civilization. To imagine that we're at a time now where we have technology that one can never have imagined could have existed, and yet we're unable to live in harmony with each other. Now, surely the church has to hold responsibility for a large part of that.
No question about that. But at the same time, the church has also brought some enormous gifts to Western civilization. Almost all universities started as Christian schools of learning. Almost all hospitals started as Christian schools of learning. Now, our record is certainly not clean, but it's a mixed bag. It's not all bad either. The great universities of Europe all started as Christian training schools, and the great hospitals of Europe have all started as Christian hospitals, where we care for the poor and the sick and the indigent. Those are part of our history too. I'm proud of some parts of Christian history. I'm ashamed and embarrassed about other parts. I think anti-Semitism is a Christian gift to the world. And when anti-Semitism reached its fever pitch in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, I watched, and history makes this very clear, I watched the Pope not do anything. I watched the Lutheran leadership of Germany not do anything. I watched the, quote, Christian, unquote, nations of England and Canada and the United States stand by idly and just watch. I think we are responsible for the Holocaust in the same way that I think Nazi Germany is. And it's, to me, that was a tragedy. I have a German Lutheran pastor friend who's near Frankfurt, and he says if it hadn't been for a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he could not have remained a Christian, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one member of the German Lutheran Church that stood up to Hitler, and he paid for it with his life. He was hanged by the Nazis in prison camp of Flossenburg about 2 weeks before the Alliance. There were some martyrs. Christianity has always had, in its minority, it's frequently never had an integrity in its majority. But I think if you go back to the biblical story, the Christian church's job is not to be the majority. It's to be the light in the darkness. It's to be the leaven in the loaf. It's to be the salt in the soup. And stop trying to build institutional power and begin to concentrate on our society, I think we'd be in a lot stronger position.
Now, Bishop Spong, this is just wonderful to listen to you. I've got messages coming in saying how much people are enjoying listening to you. I'm afraid, sadly, though, we are out of time. With your permission, I'm going to ask you on air, whilst we're still on air, if I could ask you to come back on very soon again so we can continue this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to have to cut you off. I've got another interviewee just waiting in the wings for me. But Bishop Spong, pleasure, absolute delight to hear you speak today. John Shelby Spong, retired American Bishop of the Episcopal Church, living now in New Jersey. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
This is iTalk FM.